Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Wendy Doniger. And today we're discussing Wendy Doniger's book titled The Donigers of Great Neck. So it's good to have you back on History by Podcast, Wendy. It's been a while.
It has most
Hope everything's good. Yeah,
Yes, good summer.
excellent. I'm glad to hear it. So before I get to the questions, can you tell us a little bit about what the book is about? When the Donigers of Great Neck, like the background. What is the book about exactly? Mm.
Well, the book started out at a lecture I was invited to give that scholars of an age are often invited to give about the important influences on them, on their intellectual career. And when I started thinking of my high school teachers and my university professors, I suddenly realized that the most important intellectual influences in my life were my parents, who were extraordinary people. And I wrote the lecture, and it's available, the Hastings lecture. But I also started to write a book. And when I was invited to give a series of lectures at Brandeis, I said, "How about I give these autobiographical lectures?" They said, "Fine." And so that was a series of lectures at Brandeis and was published as the book. And the book started out being about me and about who was important to me, but the egotism of that point of view evaporated fairly soon. And I realized that what was really interesting was my parents, that they had been, as individuals, unusual people. They'd lived at an important and dramatic period in American history. My mother was born in 1911, my father in 1909. They had been refugees from Europe. They had lived through World War II. Had gotten in trouble with McCarthy during communism. They'd been part of American history, and also they were both rather unusual individuals. So the book was more and more about them. And then the more I wrote it, I realized it was also about me because all my life I'd always been daddy's girl. I'd been closer to him. He'd been nicer to me. I thought he was the parent that meant most to me. My mother and I fought a lot. When he died quite young, I was sorry that it was he who had died first because I got along so well with him. And as I wrote the book, I realized how my mother had really been more important to me in many ways, had been closer to me, and had actually loved me more than I had ever realized. By the time I wrote the book, she was dead too. Um, but it really was a way, writing is always for me a way of discovering something. And in this case, it was autobiographical discovery. I discovered that although my relationship with my mother was indeed difficult, it was important. And so she became more, in some ways, the heroine of the book, the more important person, the most important person in the book, I think. And so it was a great pleasure for me to write the book, and it's been a great success. I never thought anyone would be interested in it, but people have, and so that was a good series of pieces of luck, really, to make that come out so well.
Can you tell us a bit about your work trying to retrieve the memories of your parents?
Well, I began with what I thought I remembered myself. Then I had some few documents, some letters and things, not that many. But I also had the rest of my family. I have two brothers, one of whom is 10 years older than I am, and one of whom is 10 years younger than I am. So you had two generations of supporting memories. So when I wrote the first draft, I ran it by them, and they said, "Oh no, it wasn't like this; it was like that." And how? Why have you left out the story of this and the story of that? So I got a lot of feedback and data really from my two brothers. My older brother is died a few years ago. My younger brother is still very close to me. So then there were some documents. There was my father's obituary. There was a series of documents in the Congressional Record when he was attacked by McCarthy. But mostly it was just a family memory. Um, and between us, we remembered a lot. I published it about 10 years ago, I think. When did I publish it? Do you have the date? I don't have it with me. Um, and my memory now is not as nearly as good as it was then. I could never write that book now. I wrote it just in time. I've started forgetting more and more things about my youth now. So it was a lucky moment when I still had a lot of it in my head, when my older brother was still alive, who had a lot in his head. So I had some help, but most of it came just from memory.
So let's talk about the beginning here. What was your parents' childhood? Like what do you know about that in both Europe and America? What was that experience?
I know a lot about both of their childhoods. They told me a lot. My mother grew up in Vienna with a wealthy Jewish family. They were both my parents were Jewish, but my mother's family wouldn't be caught dead in a synagogue. They were not religious Jews at all. They were not practicing Jews. My mother said that they didn't think Hitler meant them. Um, and then they became apparent that Hitler did indeed mean them, and they left. They left in the they left well they left several times. They started living in Great Neck in the 20s and going back and forth between Great Neck and Vienna. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was an opera singer, a second-rate opera singer, but an opera singer. And they went back and forth a lot on ships. There were enormous trunks in my attic that said "not needed on voyage" that they had used for these trips back and forth. So they kept going back and forth until finally Hitler invaded Poland, and they stayed in America. My father, by contrast, grew up dirt poor in a part of Europe that was Poland, that was Russia, that was Germany, that little piece of land that went back and forth, suffered the pogroms, and finally left. All he and his four siblings, there were five children, he was the youngest of five children, they all left in 1918 and moved to Brooklyn and grew up in America. One of them, Sonia, went to Sweden and stayed in Sweden, but the others all lived in Brooklyn and then in Great Neck, actually, the brothers. So it was a very different situation um, in terms of their money, in terms of the countries they were in, their relationship to Judaism. Um, really, very different lives, um, different kinds of refugees, different kinds of childhoods, um, very different.
And what do you know about your father and mother's ancestry, their origins? Like, where did they come from?
Well, my mother's family came from Czechoslovakia. My mother's family, my grandmother's family came from Czechoslovakia. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a Hungarian. Um, my father's people lived in that part of Poland, otherwise known as Russia, otherwise known as Germany. And I don't know how far back the records go in either family, really.
Mm.
A couple of generations at the most. Um, I know that my great grandmother, my mother's mother's mother, named Franzi Baruch, ran the Hotel New York in Marienbad, which was the best hotel in Marienbad at a time when Marienbad, remember last year in Marienbad and all of that, and Marienbad was a very fancy place indeed. And they lost it, of course, when the Nazis came in. But I visited it. It's called something else now. It's still there, and it's still the best hotel. Um, so they came from that kind of a family. Um, my father's people, my father's father was a kind of small-time rabbi who read all the time, but the family were
Mm.
perhaps woodcutters who supplied the wood to the Don Cossacks. The question of where the name Doniger comes from, probably it means the people of the Don, and it may in fact reflect the fact that they were very poor people. I have pictures of my father in front of what I would call a shack, which was his house, and I have pictures of my mother with her governess in Vienna in front of a very fancy house. So they were really very different indeed.
So, how did your parents, Lester and Rita, meet? Can you tell us about the circumstances of how they met?
They both ended up in Great Neck. My mother, as I
Mm.
said, they had had a house in Great Neck in the 20s, which they had used part of the time when they were back and forth to Vienna, and then they stayed in that house in Great Neck, which was a very nice house. I saw it when I was a little girl. My father was working in the Witchwood Pharmacy in Great Neck and commuting from Brooklyn, where they all lived together under rather not, I wouldn't call it slum conditions, but uh, they were not rich. They lived in a little place in Brooklyn. But he spent more and more time in Great Neck working at the pharmacy. And both my mother and my father were tennis players. And one
Mm.
day there was big, I remember the court fair with a big tennis court in the middle of a park in Great Neck. And my father went there to meet a man that he was supposed to play tennis with. And while he was waiting, my mother was there hitting the ball around. She said, "You want to play?" I said he didn't want to play with a girl. He said, "No, I'm waiting for somebody else." But his partner did not show up. So he had to play with my mother. And she beat him in straight sets. And that was the beginning of a beautiful romance and friendship. And they eventually married and had me and my brother Tony. So they met on the tennis court.
Was Lester's profession always pharmaceutical, or did that change eventually?
Oh, that changed. He did that when he was just a kid. Um,
Mm.
he had gotten a scholarship to go to night school at NYU. He was still working at the pharmacy during the day, but he went to NYU night school. Thomas Wolfe was one of his teachers. He was always very proud of it. Majored in English, got a BA from NYU, and then he and my mother married, and they set up a publishing business. They published a monthly, was it weekly? A weekly journal called Pulpit Digest, which was a magazine for the Protestant clergy where they printed sermons. And they discovered that some Protestant clergymen would like to see their sermons in print, and some Protestant clergymen would like to see each week the sermons of other Protestant clergymen. So they published this digest, and sometimes when they ran out of copy, they wrote the sermons themselves, these two Jewish refugees. I taught for many years in a divinity school at the University of Chicago, and I knew ordained Protestant ministers who would use they said, "Pulpit Digest, we all know Pulpit Digest. Of course we use Pulpit Digest." And they were appalled to hear that they may well have preached sermons that were written by two Jewish refugees. But in any case, it was a great success. And eventually, my father invented something called the Minister's Dollar Book Club, which was the first book club in America, which was advertised in the Pulpit Digest and so forth. And then he and Bennett Cerf got together and they started the Book of the Month Club, which was a much bigger enterprise and so forth. But it all began with him and my mother writing these sermons. They didn't write all of them. They mainly had sermons by real Protestant ministers, but they wrote some of them. And then he became a very successful publisher altogether. Had a press called Channel Press and published a lot of good books. Upton Sinclair, a lot of good books.
And what was Rita's profession?
Rita, to her undying fury, had no profession. Rita was smart as a whip. She was smarter than he was. He was smart enough, but she was really brilliant. She never finished high school, which something she complained of all her life. She was going back and forth between Great Neck and Vienna all the time. They kept taking her out of school. She never finished. She never finished. So she never actually graduated from high school at all. Her parents divorced, and she was forced to raise her four younger siblings, whom she came to despise, and they didn't like her much either. It was not a very good relationship. She was hardly any older than they were, and she was in charge of them. And two of them, the twins, who were actually quite stupid, went on to college. And my mother was furious that they went to college and she didn't. So she was fluent in 3 or 4 languages. She spoke, of course, English and German. She also spoke French and Italian. She had read all the literatures in all of those languages. She was quite a good painter. She had studied painting, and she was also a great connoisseur of art. She was a fine pianist. She used to accompany my grandmother, who was a second-rate opera singer, and my mother knew a lot of piano music by heart and played very well. She was multi-talented and never actually accomplished anything, which she bitterly resented, just bitterly. She could have done all sorts of things, and she ended up raising me and Tony. She said she was happy doing that, and she loved us both and was proud of us, and that's what she had. But she would have liked to have had something of her own too, so much. And that was part of the trouble between us, was that she was so proud of me. I did so well at Radcliffe, I did so well at Harvard, but she was also envious because she had a feeling, which I think was probably true, that she would have done better than I did if she had had the chances that she gave me. So that was a trouble between us.
Did she ever, has she ever thought about, did she give any thought to returning to, or perhaps just finishing college at least, and trying to,
Finished high school. She never
uh,
finished high school.
right,
No,
right, she didn't even finish that, yeah.
no, no. She was a wife and a mother. She kept house for my father. She raised us. That's what she did. She read. She did some writing. We found a lot of writings when she died. Um, but no, no, it was not available to her in those days. Uh, no, it's a shame.
Can you elaborate more on your better relationship with your father and the conflicts, the issues you had with your mother?
Well, he, she was a fine cook, a really quite talented cook, and she was also a great gardener. We had spectacular flowers. So I never learned to cook, and I never went near the garden. My brother Tony is a wonderful cook. He learned a lot from her. He knows her techniques. He has some of her special pots that he inherited and so forth. Um, so he took after her in a way. I mean, he learned some of her skills, which were the skills that a woman would traditionally have learned. And I just wanted to be like Daddy. I wanted to write books. I wanted to be in the book world. Um, I admired him, and he had been to college, and he was very proud that I went to college and so forth. So he read everything I wrote and gave me great feedback on it and helped teach me how to write. I gave stuff to her. She said she didn't have time to read it. I never had any response from her from anything that I wrote. Um, that was just the way that was.
And what about your father? What did he think of what you wrote?
My father was a wonderful editor, and I always tried to be to my students what he was to me. Whatever I wrote, I knew he would like it. He always said he liked it. I think he did like it. He would say, you need more of this, less of that. He would say, you need a stronger beginning or something of that sort. But I knew he was on my side. And as I was writing, I was always thinking, he's going to like this. He was a most encouraging reader. And indeed, when I started working with my own graduate students, I worked, I helped 85 graduate students successfully complete their dissertations. I tried to be that person to them. that they knew I would like it, I'd say, okay, there are things you can fix, but basically you're on the right track and so forth. Um, and that's really one of the great things I learned from him, was how to encourage other writers. Um, all my life, I've known many brilliant, brilliant scholars, some of whom failed even to get tenure because, well, at the University of Chicago, anyway, we had to write books to get tenure, and they knew so much. They knew so much more than I did. I wrote books all the time. I always figured everyone was going to like what I wrote. Not everybody did, but I always thought they would. I thought this is going to be great. They're going to like this. And they were frightened. What if I write this? What if they don't like it? And they didn't get tenure and they didn't keep their jobs and their lives were ruined. Really talented people because they imagined hostile readers. And I always imagined a very, very encouraging reader and tried to be that person for my students. So that was an important piece in my life.
Was there ever a point that you thought that, okay, this is going to be the moment that you and your mother become closer and not so distant? Or was there never really a moment like that?
We became closer years later. Um, in 1971, my father died, and I had my one child. And that was not a good time for me. I had loved him so much I really didn't know how I was going to manage without him, and it was a hard time for her too. Um, she was of the generation where a woman's status was closely linked to that of her husband, and without him, she lost. She wasn't who she had been in the social world that they had lived in. So we were both in a bad shape, and we had a terrible fight. And for a while, we didn't speak at all. And then time passed, and I recovered, and she became older, and I had more compassion for her. And I was living in England. She would come to visit us in England. Eventually, I moved back to California, um, and then to Chicago, and she came to visit me there. And as the years passed, we got along much better. The one who really got along with my mother was my son Mike, who eventually went to NYU. And my mother was living in Great Neck, where I grew up, the Donigers of Great Neck. She was still in that house in Great Neck. She died in that house in Great Neck, where I grew up. And my son Mike would come and visit her, take the Long Island Railroad from NYU. Um, and that was the great bond. Those were the two that got along really, really well. That's where the final closeness really came, between her and Mike. That was very nice. That's how that worked out. My mother was, as I said, a communist. Her great war was the Spanish Civil War. Mike was a historian at NYU, and he wrote his dissertation on the Jews in the Abraham Lincoln Battalion at the Spanish Civil War. And he discussed it with her. She knew a lot about the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. She was a member of the Abraham Lincoln. We gave them money. Um, so that's where the rapprochement really came. It came in the next generation. We stopped
Who were
fighting.
Rita? Mm.
We stopped fighting years ago, but we didn't. We weren't close, the way that Mike and my mother were close. Sorry, go on. Who were who? You're going to ask me something else.
I was gonna ask, who were Rita and Lester to one another?
It was a strange marriage. They had a lot of fun together. They laughed a lot together. Um, uh, they lived separate lives in some ways. My father had his life as a publisher, went into New York a lot. Um, my mother stayed in Great Neck, was really what used to be called a homemaker. She took care of the house and so forth. Um, we took vacations together. They remained quite close, but they were different people, really, in some ways. Um, I don't think she was very happy in the marriage, and I don't know if he was happy in the marriage. they weren't the sort of people that got divorces, that's for sure. But I felt that there were things that were missing between them. We had a lot of fun. We laughed a lot together. Um, it was a good marriage. I think it was. They struck a bargain and they kept it. Um, it was, I think, a good marriage. They were both really bright and they had wonderful talks. They also had wonderful arguments. They had political. They were both very political. My father was a Roosevelt man, a very serious Democrat. My mother was a communist. And I remember the fights. I think whatever else was wrong in the marriage, they channeled into the politics and the fights at the dinner table. People threw down napkins and left the table with a plate half empty. And oh, yeah, that's what they fought about. They fought about politics.
And did it always remain like that, or did it at some point did it ever calm?
I don't think either one of them ever calmed down. My father was a sulker. When he lost a fight, he would simply go, just retire and not speak to anybody for hours or days at a time. And she could sulk too. It never lasted that long. They always made it up. Um, they never reconciled their political differences ever. Um, she went to her grave. Not just my mother was not just a communist. My mother was a Stalinist. And I remember that Daddy used to tell a story that when I was a tiny little girl, I was born in 1940, so I was a baby during World War II. But when Stalin signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler, my father said, my mother went upstairs and stayed in bed for, I think, 3 days. And whoever took care of me, I don't know, because I was a little 2 or 3 years old. I was 4 years old. And then she came downstairs after those days and she said, Stalin did what he had to do, and she remained a Stalinist. That was the great crisis of her life. Um, and that was many, many years later. I had an occasion to give some lectures in Germany, in Berlin, and also in Potsdam, the little town near Berlin, where the Potsdam Conference took place between Stalin and Roosevelt and Truman, because sorry, not Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill and Truman, because Roosevelt had just died. And I went to the room where the conference between these great leaders had taken place at the end of World War II. And I sat in the seat where Stalin had sat. And I thought, Mama, wherever you are, I'm doing it. You would have loved to have done this. It was my final tribute to my mother, was sitting in Stalin's chair at the Potsdam Conference.
Can you tell us a little bit about what attracted your father to the democratic thinking, and what attracted your mother to the communist thinking?
Interesting. My father was a great American patriot. He had lived the American dream. He came over on a boat wearing the one suit of clothes he had. He was a little boy. He was, I guess, 11 or 12, a little kid. Lived was taken in by relatives that had come over before, and he lived to become a millionaire publisher. Um, this country was very good to him. He loved it very much, um, and was a Democrat, and was an FDR man, as I think any intelligent person was in those days. Um, my mother was just more radical in every way. My mother never believed anything anybody else believed. Whatever you believe, she believed something different. She was a rebel, and I think that's part of what appealed to her in communism. And I think also she just uh, rightly distrusted capitalism, as the years have proven her right to be. She was right and he was wrong. Um, she just had her own theories, and she read widely, and she was a Marxist, and um, so they didn't change. My father always loved this country and was always a Democrat. And my mother was always a rebel in every way, and saw correctly, as I now believe, the deep flaws in capitalism that are producing all the problems we see today. So they never changed. They never changed one another. He went on his way, and she went on her way. As the years went by, they didn't fight and argue anymore. They just didn't. They didn't discuss it anymore. Uh, when I was young is when I remember the fights. After a while, he just did his thing and she did her thing.
How did Lester and Rita economize?
Well, um, when I was young, they economized together. That is to say, there was very little money, and my mother was very, very good at saving and scrimping. No piece of food was ever thrown away. Whatever was left was used the next day to cook in something else. The house was always very cold because she didn't turn up the thermostat because she was saving money on fuel. Um, I always wore home hand-me-downs from other members of the family, and when I outgrew a dress, it wasn't thrown out. She sewed a hem around it to make it longer so I could wear it another year. So they were together in that, that's for sure. He made what money he could, and she stretched it out, as only a refugee knows how to stretch out money. Then he made a whole lot of money. All of a sudden, we were rich, and we moved to a big house, and we took vacations in the Caribbean and flew first class and all that sort of thing. My father really enjoyed his money. My mother was still saving the pieces of meat from each meal. When she went shopping, she went to the butcher's and she took the pieces of meat that had been reduced because he hadn't sold them the day before. When she went to the greengrocer's, she bought the pieces of fruit that had fallen down and gotten squashed and were cheap. So we continued to eat these scrappy meals, which were often inedible, while my father was going to New York every day with his publisher friends and having lunch at the Forum of the 12 Caesars or Lutece or something. So he often just didn't eat dinner. He just came home and said he wasn't hungry anymore. So they had very different ways of dealing with the money that he made when he finally made it. She did buy paintings. She took the money that she was saving from the squashed fruit and the rotten meat, and she invested in what became some very valuable paintings eventually. That's what she bought. She bought paintings, but she always bought anything. She never bought anything that wasn't on sale. And just as I neither cook nor garden because of her, I can't bear to buy anything on sale ever. If I go to a shop and I see something I want, and they say, actually, you're lucky that item is on sale, I say, when will the sale end? And they tell me when the sale ends, and I go back and I buy it when it's no longer on sale. So we each have ways of dealing with the habits of youth. But that's what I got from my mother's um, savings. She's when my mother when she had a piece when she had blew her nose on a piece of Kleenex, she would take the piece of Kleenex and carefully Kleenex is actually 2-ply. She would divide it in half and use one half at a time of the Kleenex. We never ever got anything in a store bought box. It was always a box left over from something else. She saved the box, she saved the paper, she saved everything. But nothing was ever new, it seemed, in the house. It was always reused from something else, and the food was never new. My brother Tony once went to visit a friend when he was little. He was like 6 or 5 or something. And he came back. I was 16 or 15. We were 10 years apart. And he said he went to this house and he had dinner at his friend's house and he said they had new food. Amazing thing. That's the thing you noticed most. Yeah, so we never had new food at at house. So,
Can you tell us how did Lester pass away, and What became of his legacy?
Well, he got cancer and died of it. I don't know, that's how. Um,
Hmm.
he had been sick for a while, and he didn't want to saddle my brother Tony with the business. So he sold it. He sold it before he died. Um, and Tony, in fact, did not become a publisher. Tony became a very successful lawyer. Um, he died. Daddy died in 1971. I was um, 31, and Tony was just 21. Tony was still in college, um, and hadn't really found his way. He became, as I said, a very successful lawyer. Um, so the legacy was an intellectual legacy, but neither one of us became a publisher. I spent my whole career with publishers. I published about 40 books, and so publishers were always my friends. So I lived in the world of publishing, but I wasn't a publisher myself. No, it was Tony. Um, but it was his intellectual legacy, and of course, the money that put us through college and graduate school. So that was it too. He put us through school.
What were Rita's two different accounting systems in valuing you?
And what do you mean accounting systems? Huh. It's not, you're not triggering something I know. Whatever you're thinking of, I think of it differently.
Hmm. It was, let me see if I find the page.
Huh.
My question came from,
You mean the way
it's
she
at page
thought
124.
that she thought
Yeah,
of me and her?
yeah,
You don't mean money
yeah.
accounting. Yes.
No, I don't.
The way she thought of me and her. That was a that was a strange thing. So she was proud of me um, to other people because she thought that my success as a scholar reflected on her. She had a brilliant daughter. So when she was looking at talking to other people, she and I were a kind of a unit in which the better I was, the better she was. She bragged about, exaggerated my achievements and so forth. But when we were together, it was as if we were competing for a limited amount of intellectual success. And if she was to be smart, I had to be stupid. So when she spoke about me to other people, how brilliant my daughter is, but when she spoke to me personally, she said, "How is it you don't know that? You don't know anything. You don't know anything." So that was the two different accounting systems, I guess you had in mind. Whether we
Yeah.
were a unit or whether we
Um,
were separate
mhm.
competing units was the different way of reckoning up our combined virtue.
What made her say or think that Jesus was homosexual?
My mother thought everybody was homosexual. That's the short answer. Um, she was right about a lot of people who were closeted. She was interested in homosexuality. I think maybe she would have liked to have been gay herself, but it was not on the cards. But she was fascinated by um, Gertrude Stein and some of the other famous gay women. Um, always interested in them. Lillian Hellman. So she was interested in gay people, and she had a lot of gay male friends too. She liked gay people, and she knew a lot of them. Um, and she thought correctly, really, that a lot of people who were thought to be straight or gay. She always insisted that John Wayne was gay. That was the one she was absolutely certain of, that John Wayne was gay. And in fact, his name wasn't John, right? It was he had a woman's name. What's John Wayne's real name? I can Google it if I weren't in the middle of this.
It was Marion Robert Morrison.
Marion, Marion, that's right. He said, "Look, his name is
Hmm.
Marion. Of course he's gay." Um, So she knew that John Wayne was gay. She thought she knew that Rock Hudson was gay long before the people knew that Rock Hudson was in fact gay. So she got some of them right. Um, but she was just fascinated by gay people. She loved them. Her friends were gay. Um, and it was important to her. Um, who knows what she would have been in another world? Maybe she would have liked to have been gay herself. But it was certainly an important part of her worldview that gay people were, generally speaking, smarter and more interesting than straight people, and that a lot of people that you thought were straight were in fact gay. That was one of the themes of her life. And she was right. She was right about most things. She wasn't right about Jesus, perhaps, but Jesus was a bit going. She said, when we asked her, "How do you know Jesus is gay?" She said, "You can see it from his face in the paintings." That's how she knew Jesus was gay. Um, I think what she probably meant was that in some ways Jesus was asexual, and which, as far as we know from the historical record, such as it is, may well have been true. But no, but she liked Jesus, and so she thought he must have been gay.
And can you tell us how she passed away?
She just got older and sicker and sicker and sicker. She had asthma. She had very bad asthma. She had a lot of allergies. My father, as I said, died in 1971. And after a few years, she just stayed home in Great Neck and stopped going into Manhattan the way she used to do. And after a few more years, she didn't even get out of bed. She got out of bed to go to the bathroom to have something to eat, but she basically spent the last 10 years of her life in bed. Um, and she finally died quietly of a heart attack all alone in that house. Her sisters kept saying, "You shouldn't," her sisters whom she despised, her younger sisters, the twins, they kept saying, "You shouldn't rattle around in that old house." It was a big house. "You shouldn't rattle around. You should move to an apartment." And my mother said, "I don't rattle. I walk from room to room and look at my paintings." And that's what she did. And she stayed in that house and stayed looking at her paintings, um, and died alone. The cleaning lady or somebody found her. I visited her from time to time. My brothers, I lived in Chicago. My two brothers, my older brother Jerry and my younger brother Tony, lived on the East Coast, and they visited her more. Um, but she lived alone mostly, um, those years. She listened to music. She watched movies. Um, it was a bad decade, I think. I have a photograph of her near her death. We came to see her a lot. There was her birthday party and so forth. But mostly she was alone in those years. It was a sad life. I think I think she used to say, "Je ne suis pas heureuse." She used to say that she was not content with her life. Um, she never stopped minding that she had been unable to become the person she knew she could have been. So it wasn't that she was unhappy in the marriage, that she didn't like my father. They got along well. He was a good man. She used to say he's a very good man. She was proud of me and Tony. She had money and nice things, but she was not a happy woman. She was unfulfilled. She knew she could have done something and been someone. Had her parents not divorced and saddled her with raising her siblings. That's what ruined her life.
And in my closing question, what made you rethink and realize that in some ways you were closer to her more than you actually realized?
Writing the book, really. Um, I'd always been Daddy's girl. He was always nice to me, and she was always critical of me. And by the time I wrote the Donigers of Great Neck. I'd been through my big fight with the government of India on the issue of the Hindus. And I did what seemed to be the obvious thing to do. I wrote the book and said what I thought was the case. And when I got in trouble with it, I worked with the publisher. When the publisher, Penguin, folded, I got another publisher. And so it never occurred to me to stop saying what I thought was the truth about what was happening in India, even though I got a great deal of hate mail and indeed a lawsuit and a lot of other stuff. And I realized that I was doing what my mother would have done. That kind of fighting against the authorities, really, about the powers that be, was not something my father ever did. My father made friends with the enemy. He talked them around. He compromised. He managed to get things done by being really nice to everyone. He had a way with people. The people who worked with him loved him, and so forth. So there were never fights. My mother fought with everybody. And so when I found myself in a big fight, it was my mother's spirit that told me what to do and that gave me what courage it took. I wasn't in physical danger, but I had a bodyguard for a while. There were some threats. I guess I was in some physical danger. It never seemed intense. So anyway, it was a difficult time, and I had to be pretty sure that I was right when so many people were saying I was wrong. And it was my mother's voice in me that said, "You know you're right. Hang in there. Don't give in." It was not my father's voice. I don't know what he would have said. Take it easy. Don't say what you're saying, so-called. Is there another way you could say it that won't make them so mad? I don't know what he would have said. Something like that. But she said, just, toe the line. So I realized that I was actually, I wasn't daddy's girl at that point. I was my mother's girl. It was a very interesting insight. Stunning, surprising, and satisfying in a way.
I just want to tell everybody real quick to go get the book. The History Valley Amazon affiliate link's in the description below, and it's also in the pinned comment. Of that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Professor Wendy Doniger.
Thank you for asking such good questions. It was really fun to answer them.
And thank you for joining me. This was definitely fun.
I had fun.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.